All right, we're good? All right, so why don't we get started? So apparently Vince gave this awesome lecture on hospitality last year. This is not that lecture. So thinking about this, I mean, there are tons of different things in our sources. And so since I'm a Reconstructionist, I figured that at least have a conversation about it in more of a Reconstructionist way for people who aren't familiar with that. So let's talk about what sources do we have that talk about hospitality. So why don't we start with the Eddas? Anybody got something from the Eddas with hospitality?
Breath through the small. Breath through the small.
Breath through the small, okay. And what's going on in breath through the small?
Oh, it shows up at breath through the small, and it ends up in a riddle contest for his head.
Okay, so a riddle contest for his head with the host from the guest. We also have Grimness Small, where Odin shows up and due to some scheming on some people's part ends up tied over a fire. And when it's found that he's really Odin, the king who had him tied up and put over the fire falls on his sword and dies. So, and his son, who is the only one who showed hospitality to Odin, becomes king and a wise king. We also have in the Havamal, there's a variety of sections about providing for a guest when they come. But it also talks about there's great strife between guests in the hall, or another possibility. So then we get into...
Kimstavida, when Thor and Tyr or Loki shows up at the Hall of Heimir.
Okay, so they show up at the Hall of Heimir.
And then Heimir basically has to put them up even though he doesn't particularly want to, and then takes Thor fishing.
Okay, so he takes Thor fishing, and even though he's not particularly happy about it, they go out, they fish for the Mythgard serpent. He cuts the line, and Thor's pretty pissed off that the Mythgard serpent may or may not go away. So there's this underlying idea about hospitality. So then we get into other sources like the sagas. So hospitality happens in a lot of the sagas. But let's think about Egil's saga. What do we know about hospitality in Egil's saga?
That if you feed your host something bad, or you feed your guest something bad, he'll throw up in your face.
Yes, okay, so what happens? Egil shows up, it's been a hard day rowing. They show up, they say, hey, we need to stay here. The guy says, that's fine, but you know what, we're out of beer. There is no beer here. All we have is whey. So they all drink whey, and they drink whey to the point that they throw up. And they're kind of unhappy. Well, it turns out that then the king's men show up to collect their taxes, and there's beer. It was just in the shed, and he wasn't willing to offer any to them. So, you know, things kind of escalate. In the middle of the night, Egil sets it up, so the guy walks outside, and he stabs him, and off he goes on his way. Because he gave them whey instead of beer, and claimed to have none as part of the sort of hospitality. And this isn't the only thing that happens where Egil gets on the king's bad side, but because the guy he killed is one of the king's men, the king steadily becomes increasingly upset with these sorts of decisions that Egil makes. We have in Njal Saga, Flosi shows up to one of his opponent's house and goads him into attacking him. We have in Grettir Saga. Now this is a great one because it's Grettir. Grettir's an asshole. Everybody knows that. Grettir is a pain in the ass. But he shows up, he gets in conflict with a guy there, lots of stuff, and there's a bunch of rivalry. It takes pages to talk about. But the guy who's in charge says, hey, I don't want you to do anything to him in my house. If there's a problem, I'll settle it. So things continue onwards. The guy keeps mocking Egil, or mocking Grettir, and finally they leave. Well, they happen to meet each other elsewhere, and now it's like, wait, I'll settle this. I'll settle this with money. Grettir, we don't need to have a problem. Grettir says, fuck you, and kills him, which leads into a variety of other killings because then he has to kill the man's brothers because they won't accept money. for this element, but it came back to this sort of within the hospitality, even though Greta is this aggressive figure and constantly causing trouble, he does actually manage to keep that and then take his revenge outside of that. In Gisli's saga, Gisli has been literally run out of Iceland due to a curse, and he's on one of the islands, and they go look for him there because the craftsmanship is so good, it's not the guy he's staying with. So what does that mean, though, when we talk about hospitality in general? So you need to be a good guest, and you need to be a good host. That's what all these conflict is about. Gisli isn't just sitting on his butt consuming food. He is doing things. He is crafting things for his hosts. He isn't just sleeping on the couch and drinking your beer. Greta manages to contain himself, and though later he can't control his temper, he's behaving properly as a guest within that. He's still pissed off, he still feels slighted, and he takes revenge for it later, but he is a good guest, and that strife does not happen at the request of the person he's staying with. In Egil's saga, if you provide crappy hospitality, people are going to be mad, and well, what do we know about in the sagas that happen when people are mad? They kill you. That's what happens. So we have these underlying kind of different pieces of hospitality within those sources. What we also have is laws. So there are laws that you have to provide lodging for people in Iceland if they stopped, if it was a certain point before nightfall, particularly on Saturday evenings. And traders have to be boarded. If the trader shows up at your house and the sun is almost to a certain regulatory distance, it has to be standing on a beach, and it's a certain distance above on a beach, looking a certain way, you have to accept them into your house. That is the law. But one of the other things that we need to consider about this is, when do these sources come about? So the Gragas, the laws, they're the 13th century. They're far after the Christianization of Iceland, and while they do refer to some heathen things, part of why Saturday travel is so important is that Sunday is a holy day. When we look at the other sagas, particularly Greta's saga is a later saga, so there's definitely going to be some interpretation that's having in these stories as we have them now. Well, we know Egil was a real person. They found his body. They can explain the medical conditions that are described in the saga through what we know now about medicine. He was a real person. But the stories we have about him come through us through a particular lens. And so what we have to think about is what all of that means together, and what are the weaknesses of. So what are some of the others as sort of modern heathens in America? What sort of weaknesses are our saga sources might have for most heathens? Well, for example, a lot of people probably have that free source you found on the internet, which means it's out of copyright. And what are they? Oftentimes they are Victorian era translations of things. Now, does that mean that, oh, it's crap and it doesn't mean anything? No, but there are certain biases that have a tendency to come through in the sources. There's one of the popular and easily available translations of Greta's saga says, oh, there's a lacuna in the manuscript. There's not a lacuna in the manuscript. It's inappropriate to discuss in polite company in the Victorian era what happens in that section of the manuscript. So it's just left out. And it gives you an entirely different perspective of Greta, knowing that that's there. So we have to be careful of our sources and the biases in not just the people who wrote them down, but in the people who translate them for us. And so we have to keep in mind, like, this greater sort of, as we're constructing our lens of what's hospitality, that all of these different things are happening on the sources and the pieces we know. Because then how does hospitality then affect us as modern heathens? I mean, what is good hospitality to us? Anyone?
Offering someone food and drink.
Yes, you offer someone food or drink when they come to their house. I have never met a heathen who doesn't. Always. Doesn't matter if you're there for 5 minutes or if you're there for 15 minutes. That's something that happens among heathens. And it's something that comes over from this idea of hospitality that we know. But that means that you see over and over again, one of the big things in any talk on hospitality is don't be a bad guest. Because if you read enough on the internet, everybody talks about how they made really bad decisions about letting someone into their home, and that escalated into a fight because they had different ideas about heathenry and stuff like that. So you need to be a good guest, and you need to be a good host. And our sources tell us that both of those things are important. You can't just let your guests walk all over you. You can't just walk all over your hosts. Other parts of that, I read something the other week that the FBI is well aware that hospitality is important to us and has used that to place informants for court cases. Does that mean you shouldn't be hospitable? No, but that means that everyone else who is aware of us on the outside is also expecting you to be hospitable, and you will be judged by that. For good or for ill. Now, hopefully none of us here have the FBI interested in them, and that's an issue, and it doesn't mean don't be hospitable. But that means that that is something that everyone else who knows something about us is aware of. That we offer hospitality, and since your reputation is important, if you want to keep your reputation, that's something people expect of you. But like I said, tied to that is you can't just let the guest isn't always right. You can't let them walk over you. Sometimes you need to threaten them with an axe if they're really over the top. But so I just, like I said, wanted to talk a little bit about, we have all of these different sources, and they all have their own problems, but we have this root idea of hospitality that pretty much all heathens have. Now they have it in different ways and it expresses itself differently, but we all have it and it's something we can agree on. So that was just kind of, I wanted to talk about that a little bit and have people think about, you know, no one offers you towels when you come to their house. You know, that's not, I'm not going to be offended because a heathen doesn't offer me towels, because it says give them towels, because they might be soaked to the knee. Well, you could be, but odds are here in the desert, you might be covered in mud or dust, but you're probably not soaked to the knee. But if you were traveling in Iceland, that might be the idea. And to think about also that Scandinavia and Iceland, even in the summertime, aren't necessarily great places to be outside. And so hospitality, that's also why it's tied. There are tons of rules about, in Iceland after the conversion, about what happens if you have to take a body somewhere and who has to allow you to stay there on the way to the graveyard or on the way to the baptism of a child. So rooted within the culture, there is something about hospitality and not leaving people outside. And that comes through to all of those sources to us, because in a modern society, if someone says, hey, I need a place to stay, and you say no, well, there's usually a variety of other places available to, you know, we have wonderful things like hotels and stuff like that, that it's not the same thing. So it isn't that you have no fresh towels, you're a bad heathen, or you wouldn't let me stay there, you're a bad heathen. You need to do what is right for you as a host, as well as a guest. You need to not be asking for too much. So that was just kind of what I wanted to talk about a little bit. Can anyone think of any other sources I didn't mention with hospitality in them?
What colors did you do?
I missed your sources, sorry.
Oh, sorry. The Gragas, Egil Saga, Njal Saga, Gisli, Grettir, the Eddas. I mean, you know, it's definitely there. I mean, There's probably at least something about hospitality in any of the sagas.
Even in the old Greece sagas, the sagas of Greece and of Russia, it's all over in there.
Yes, Viga Glum. The hospitality he receives when he visits his relatives in Norway isn't what he expected it would be. He comes from a wealthy family of good name. These are his kinfolks. They put him on a bench in the corner, and everybody kind of makes fun of him. Well, despite that, he ends up proving his own worth, and that, no, really, we should have treated him better. But he doesn't ever hold that against his relatives later. He's fine with that, and he inherits the luck from his grandfather while he's in Iceland. If we look at the Volsung saga. Now that's a great example of hospitality gone wrong and why you never live with your in-laws. Because what happens, there's supposed to be this great wedding feast because they had to leave early, because the king's mad that he didn't get the special magical sword from Odin. So he sets a trap. And even though they're warned ahead of time, they still have the obligation because they said they'd go. And it's a trap, and they mostly all die. A few are captured, and the story continues from there. But there was this idea that they would go and be hospitable. In Beowulf and the Finnesburg fragment, you have where there's a conflict with the guests, and it isn't a great sort of, but we don't have all of the pieces of it, but there's a conflict among the guests that lead to sort of a wider conflict within that affects the larger community. And so we need to be thinking about that whole sort of good guest and good host. And our sources really tell us that both of those things are important, because it makes for a great story when someone does something wrong, but that's why it's a great story. That's the conflict inherent in it. It doesn't mean that you just get to go be a jerk and threaten people who aren't providing the hospitality you want. There's always a sort of give and take from a modern perspective on that, and our sources tell us that it isn't cut and dry, and that it's not one or the other. So, that's all I wanted to say.
I also noticed that with letting a trader stay at your house or something, that's making sure that you're not co-opting and disrupting a community good. If you accidentally leave the guy outside and he freezes to death or whatever, then the next town doesn't get his stuff.
Kind of, but the other thing there with a trader, particularly in Iceland, is I do get his stuff. So, no, if I give him, if trader shows up, he stays with me, odds are I'm the chieftain. I usually get some sort of first pick of his goods, and we know that that's one of the things that chieftains did, and that they had something of a middleman role in some of that. And so sometimes it's portrayed as, oh no, I don't want to buy anything from you, but he gives some gigantic gift. That doesn't mean that we also don't know that chieftains didn't conspire against the traders to kill them and take their goods. And usually bad things happen later, but it wasn't necessarily the hospitality that was the problem there. Yeah.
And I think I like that idea of people, it's like you provide hospitality even to your enemies. And when your enemies leave, you can kill them, but not while they're your guests.
Yes, well, it's generally because there's something with the guest, and there's a variety of kind of hints at things that we know from different things. When Egil shows up at King Eric's in England, it's murder to kill him at night. Well, that's kind of odd, because murder is when you hide the body. Manslaughter is would say, yeah, I killed him. So there's something else going on there that we don't have really well defined. Another other source. Now there's probably a source that I don't know of that may say why that is. But there's some other thing happening, but Egil is given the opportunity to ransom his head, and he composes a 28 stanza drapa to King Eric and his accomplishments to convince him not to kill him. he promises to kill him the next time they see each other, but because it's at night. I don't remember which saga it is off the top of my head. It might be, I think it's Grettir's saga actually, where the people he's staying with, even though they are bondsmen of, not bondsmen, but they're sort of a herser or kind of an intermediate nobility with the Jarl, they actually, because Grettir is their guest, they show up and are completely prepared to fight the Jarl's men, and it essentially forces the Jarl to back down. And it's not, some of it is they have distant kinship relationships, but at least one of them is, he is my guest and staying with me. And this is now, we had someone randomly tried to kill him when he walked down the street. This is a problem, and I am willing to fight you on it because he is my guest. And so it's complex and convoluted, but it is, there are ways to be a good host and there are ways to be a good guest. And the sources support that, even though the sources themselves all have different problems and biases and lenses, we can as reconstructionists look at those and say, we have this idea of hospitality. We know it was there, but we know there are limits to hospitality. You can be outside of that. But then, you know, or sometimes it simply shows your magnanimity, because Kari Salmanderson shows up at Flossie's doorstep in the middle of a snowstorm and says, let's see what kind of chieftain he is. And he's well received, but you have to understand he just spent months hounding him and killing all of his followers in revenge for the death of his son. And then they went on a pilgrimage to Rome and had come back, but it's that sort of, there's still some give and take, and there is some risk in that too, because it's, let's see what kind of chieftain Flossie really is. And it said earlier that he would be a good chieftain, except for he got caught up in this whole mess with the burning. And that sort of plays out as he is a better chieftain at the end in his hospitality than he was when he got tangled into a variety of vengeance and then got, I guess the best way to be is he decided it was better to burn them alive than it was to go home empty-handed. And that turned out poorly in this case. It doesn't always turn out poorly, but it did in this specific instance. Anything else?
After our most recent Keeper Season Hall meeting, something that Debbie and Ace and I were talking about, John Lindau pretty often in his writings talks about the contrast between like an Odinic approach to the laws in hospitality versus like a Thor approach to the laws in hospitality. And he references like say Hrungnir riding into Asgard, or like Lokaseta with Loki, that in both instances Odin seems to feel bound by the rules of hospitality, and so the guest is allowed to get out of control, and then Thor shows up and says, screw it, I don't care, I'm taking you out regardless of what these laws and rules are. There seems to be kind of a, depending on, like I say, your kind of approach, maybe. And Linda speculates that maybe there's like a cult thing going on there, or just a difference between like the chieftains and the poets level versus like the bondsmen level.
Yeah, and that's often.
I've always kind of taken that when people bring the Loki incident up to me, is I always look at it as, stop thinking of it as gods sitting around the table with other gods, and start thinking of it as kings sitting at a table with bodyguards, or bondsmen, or loyal family members. Certain people, because they're heathen, have higher worth than other people. That doesn't mean they're always good people. So Loki's got higher worth than a bunch of other people, so Loki got to push it further. That didn't mean there wasn't a line, and that he couldn't go past it. What it took was somebody at the same level coming in, and saying, you're out of line, and I'm doing something about it.
Yes. And that's a very good point. And there is usually an association. The other thing would be sort of the Odinic cult with kings, and the Thor cult is usually associated with Mord Freeman or Iceland, and that's a different sort of level of responsibility, because what do we see in the sagas? The kings are usually assholes. That's a general trend that, and it's hypothesized in academia that has to do with the Norwegian attempt to take over Iceland, and so when these things were written down, that the Icelanders were mad and upset about that. But it doesn't change the fact that the kings are acting like jerks. I mean, there's a lot of conflict and drama that comes out of the king behaving above the law. I mean, in Egil's saga, the other piece of the conflict comes from he has an inheritance. There's some murky areas of it that did get cleared up. It is still his through his wife's. And the king says, no, I gave that to somebody else. I like him better. And it sets off this huge feud that we all love to read. But on the other hand, none of us are Egil. So. Well, thank you. It was just...
That was excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you.